Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of BookBytes. We have an absolutely fascinating discussion in store this evening, but I just want to shout out to the team at Salam Media. Who hosted the Women's Leadership Conference earlier this morning in Johannesburg. We had such robust discussions, such powerful voices heard on stage today, and I'm feeling quite inspired and motivated and rather encouraged by what I heard out there today. And so, in keeping with the theme of huge inspiration, our guest this evening is Dr. Nokuthula M Msimang, who has written numerous books and some entertaining books for children as well. She's an award-winning author, she's an academic. But in particular, we're looking at this novel that was launched this year, The Daughters of Nandi, which is fictionalized but a historical novel, a novel that draws on a deep sense of spirituality, of history, and of the experience of clans. We often talk about generational trauma, but there's generational strength that comes through this novel. And so we get to hear from the author herself exactly what it took to reach deep enough to write a novel of this nature. To quickly give you an outline, Dr. Msimang is an academic filmmaker, broadcaster, and author of 6 books for younger readers, a previous winner of the Bessie Head Writer Fellowship. Mazibuko Msimang is a Pendoring Awards finalist for her latest children's book, Kawe Mokadi Caster Semenya. She is a fellow at University of Pretoria's Future Africa Research Institute. She's also written the Soweto Tea Party, which I can't wait to get my hands on. And Daughters of Nandi is Mazibuko Msimang's debut work of adult fiction. I've just completed reading this book, and the characters are sitting with me. Good evening, Nokuthula. Wonderful to have you on the show, and thank you for carving out this time for us to discuss a beautiful new novel.
Assalamu alaikum, Shafinaaz, and thank you so much for having me on your wonderful show. I'm so excited. I've been texting you all week saying I can't wait to come on. Thank you very much for your generous words.
Absolutely. Wa alaikum salam. Blessings to you as well. You know, as I read this novel, and I love reading it fresh up, even though I received it over a week ago, I like reading it close to the follow up to to the interview, because the characters and your characters definitely are impactful and they stay with one, because you're writing. It may seem like a small book, but quite a heavyweight in its own right. You're writing across 3 generations. You've drawn such strong female characters and their support system around them, and indeed the men in their lives as well. Tell us about your writing process to begin with. What was it like developing the characters for, and indeed, the Daughters of Nandi?
Well, I think let me start with my absolute fascination with female leaders. As you rightly point out, the Daughters of Nandi really is inspired by the mother of one of the greatest military leaders in modern history, King Shaka Kasenza. So his mother, Nandi Mhlongo, was quite a formidable woman herself. So I was interested, and intrigued by this character of Queen Nandi, who raised Ushaka Kasenza. And I wondered about, rumors that I'd heard, just through oral narratives and oral history, that she was not very happy about how the Zulu household had treated her, because as the mother to the firstborn, her rank should have been really higher than that of the other wives, and she then proceeded on her deathbed to kind of, unleash this curse on future generations, and really tying them up in generational trauma, where poverty, reigns, and there's violence in the bloodline and all of that. But she regrets it in the afterlife, and then looks to these then Daughters of Nandi to assist her and to hopefully right the wrongs of the past. And that's really the story, is that will the Daughters of Nandi, Kia, who is a Motswana, Uju, who comes from Watuguza, and Amangwe, who comes from Eshowe. And all these stories are kind of, they happen over 200 years, will they be able to assist their ancestor Queen Nandi to then reverse what has happened in terms of how she was treated. So that is the story. And as you say, that these women, you know, I was interested in them being leaders as well in their own right.
I was drawn by, you know, as one follows through the story, I was deeply drawn by the sense that, look, a lot of stories are passed down in a strong oral narrative. You've accomplished a very important task here of putting this down in the form of story, a very important historical narrative in the form of story, but in a very accessible story. And I was drawn by how layered the sense of tribal protocol or cultural protocol is, from the nobility down to how women conceive their expectations within society, within the family, and all of that. And still, it seemed, especially with the first two daughters, that there was still this need to take the request to, to the elders before any decision could be made about the cleansing and any of the dreams that they were having. The dreams in themselves give them that leadership power. And yet, in the last one, she's a lot more, what's the word? She's got a lot more personal power in making those decisions for herself. Is it a story of the times that these changes happened? Were women in the past more tied to the patriarchy within cultural contexts? Um, I know there's a lot in my question there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on these questions.
Look, that's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer because it's one of those yes and no answers. On the one hand, you can see historically where women had a lot of spiritual and cultural power in some senses, depending on who you were. There were women healers who had a lot of power. But in other instances, depending on the family that they were born into or the region that they were born into, even, the amount of power that they had would vary, so it's very specific, hence, when I look at Ukia, who is in the sort of mid 1800s, she's a Motswana princess, and her father, who is a King Moahi, is very protective of her and kind of gives her the right to be in charge, but that's very specific to Kia's family. She rides a horse and she goes traveling with her father, so that is very specific. And then you have somebody like Uju, 100 years later, who in a lot of senses has less power than Kia, even though it's further on, in time and space. But she has, she is a bit more kind of constrained by the patriarchy. And she's in this, of course, very interesting relationship with Mahamba, Amangwe, in some senses, the system seems to be closing in on her, but she is much more determined. She does not have the protection of her father. She's raised by two women. Her grandmother Umamhlongo and her mother Ruth. But Amangwe, she's a fallist. She's part of the leadership at Wits University that is fighting for an equal education, and she is quite determined, to claim the power for herself. So she is quite different. So it's quite a complex situation, the question of power and the question of women's freedom, whether in cultural spaces or in spiritual spaces. I tried to look at it in a very specific way, to say that this is the woman, this is her background, this is her family situation, and these are the various ways in which she can maneuver. That yes, there is a system, but women, resist, they negotiate, and but as you rightly pointed out, that all three of them, have a sense of purpose. There are limits to their power according to time and space, but they are full human beings, even as society tries to flatten them out.
And I mean, they each have a very keen sense of their time and what's expected of them. But at the same time, there are sort of these elements, these structures that might work around them. They're very aware of those structures and how to survive within them. You very vividly portray the time of, apartheid South Africa and the forced removals and what that means for families who are, like in Uju's case with Mahamba, who have, a passion and a sense of wanting to make their lives, something of their lives, and life for their children, and how the structure keeps working against them in a way, and how they work towards that. So it was amazing how and then there's this experience with Queen Nandi, with the ancestor, that I found extremely spiritual and powerful in so many ways, because as much as we rely on intuition and this link and this connection, how aware are we until there's really that, almost like when you're reaching through a crisis, for that deep connection to get, to find solutions in the problematic times. And again, across with Amangwe, I mean, I really enjoyed that with someone with so much of youth, there's this um, almost this strong belief in how you can transcend what you can just see, and draw power from what is unseen, essentially. Is
Well,
our youth, and what's the experience been? Is our youth really reflective of an understanding of the power of the spirit world?
You know, I think if I were to look at myself, I mean, obviously I am a few decades older than Amangwe, but the worlds that I inhabited, because, a lot of people of my generation and younger, will have a kind of dual a relationship with religions, So there is the kind of the African, the ancient African religion, where ancestors are the ones who pass on your prayers, right? And give you spiritual strength, But people are also Methodist, they're Catholic, they're Muslim, they are, so it's not, I mean, I find it such a liberating and such a beautiful idea, because often people fight because of religion, right, and religious beliefs. But in Soweto, where I grew up, it's not strange to be umpostoli on the one hand. Even in my own family, there is a mosque in Shawela where some of my cousins attended the mosque, but they would be at home as well when we would have a ceremony and they would be part of that. So I found that, I mean, I think that was just so beautiful, that whole kind of diversity and people inhabiting many worlds. I mean, I thought it was so cool, and they have both, their Muslim name and an African name, and it's a beautiful thing, So I think, and I'm seeing it with younger people as well, that there is a keener awareness that spiritual resilience in moving forward is important. And of course, I'm very interested in traditional and spiritual feminist strategies, which are not necessarily very public in nature or very loud in nature, but give one a sense of resilience and purpose, And that's what we see in Amangwe. She in her DNA has Mam Slongo and the generations before. So she is on the shoulders of those giants who are the ones who stamped down the thorns, so that she can run through the forest, So I'm intrigued by the young people who seem to be born old, the Amangwas of this world. In fact, I have a lot of nieces who are very similar to Amangwa, who are, in the SRC and whatever. And I think I drew a lot of inspiration from them, who are ancient in their thinking and in their sense of purpose. And of course, because of our constitution, they are pharmacists, they are dancers, they are writers, they are singers, they are, they inhabit that sense of freedom, I think, in much more dynamic ways than I did.
I think that you're absolutely correct when you say that there's a feast of creativity and women coming into themselves, and a strong sense of showcasing identity. Not just that, but really coming into themselves in a way that's unapologetic,
Yeah.
developing voice, using voice, and there's so much inspiration for our generation to draw from the younger generation around us, and you've captured beautifully. And I said earlier when I started the interview that Daughters of Nandi also is doing something rather important, in my opinion, is documenting these cultural conversations, the protocols, the understanding that might be just veiled by, within the oral narrative. Once it's in print, becomes accessible to a larger readership that might not have had access to this kind of cultural knowledge that you've put into the book in the form of a story. Not to take away the weight from story as opposed to the academic kind of sort of reports that might be written about cultural narrative, but rather instead to say that this is another and the next dimension because of the kind of theater that fiction allows, to extend conversation. And I certainly hope that a lot more younger people are going to be picking up this book because each generation is able to identify with parts of this book. And you've also brought out the Fees Must Fall movement in such a sort of profound way. You've actually outlined it in a very, very detailed way. What was that like? I mean, did you have to speak to? You said you took inspiration from nieces and that, but you're writing three very different timelines in here. Speak to us about history as narrative and bringing that into this world of fiction.
Shafinaaz, you're going to be so jealous. I did a workshop with Maza Mengeste, believe it or not. Zukiswa Vanna, who is my publisher, organized a workshop for me with Maza Mengeste and Fred Kumalo, who of course is a master of historical narratives, And also through my career, I mean, I've been mentored by incredible writers, Zeksim Da also being another one. I've had lengthy conversations with Prof. Just about literature, about writing, and so I have had all of these free master classes by the greats, and really looking at the craft of how do you balance story and entertainment and history, because Queen Nandi was a real life character, right? What happened between the house of Uzulu Nomhlongo, those are historical facts. And in fact, around Heritage Day, I mean, I saw a YouTube clip once when the house of Mhlongo was complaining about the very thing that's in the Daughters of Nandi, about the cleansing of Queen Nandi's womb because of how she was treated, and righting the wrongs of history and so on and so forth. So it's a historical fact, right? But how then do you make it interesting and entertaining? Because I'm not writing a textbook. I'm writing a novel, and it needs to be interesting. So those workshops, formal, the Maza Mengeste one was formal, I got the certificate and everything. And informal with the likes of Professor Mda were very useful. And of course, with Zukiswa Vanna as well, in terms of story and how to layer the characters and reveal the drama, in a way that grips your readers, and in a nuanced and textured way. That was very, very useful. So I really had to trust the people who were mentoring me through the process and say, look, these are master storytellers. They've written award-winning novels. So I was quite fortunate to really be able to give myself over to that adventure and say, this is a chance of a lifetime, to have Fred Kumalo, give you feedback, to work with the Zukiswa Vannas. And once upon a time as well, I did a workshop with Aiko Yama about 2 decades ago when he came to Johannesburg to do a workshop. So I've been extremely fortunate to have, all of those tools and to be mentored in that way. It was fantastic, but it was such an adventure. I think I texted you and I said to you that I had such a good time writing the novel, and that for me was priceless. That I have an opportunity to tell the story.
Well, your absolute delight and joy in writing this novel shows because of the final product, and you've had wonderful mentorship. So we want to,
Okay.
shout out and thanks to that adventure of mentorship that you've had along the way. It shows in the final process. I've got Fred Kumalo on the show next weekend, so we're looking forward to speaking to him. As a final question,
Fantastic.
you hint in the acknowledgements that you also delved into your own. I mean, there's a link here. As much as this is history, your own family history is linked. So I'm going to throw it out and see what can you tell us about reaching into the past while you fictionalize a lot of it, and what is it like digging into sort of the treasure chest that is your own family history here?
You know what? It's such a kind of a tentative attachment because my maternal grandfather is Mhlongo.
Okay.
So very far removed from the Mhlongos. But of course, if there is a link, any kind of link with Nandi Mhlongo, sort of tentative as it might be, I'm going to kind of latch onto that. But also, as I said, that there were then these stories, oral narratives. I would hear my aunt saying, for example, if there's trouble, with relationships, they would say, "Oh my goodness, the curse of Queen Nandi. Here it is again. We will never
Okay.
know peace. So it's all of those things. So it's like even other people who are called Zulu or Dlamini or whatever. So these Zulus, obviously, we know that they are of the royal house. But there are many other Zulus who also, in some way, I suppose, feel a kind of spiritual proximity to the Zulu royal house. So I think similarly with my grandfather, he's always said to us that, rebirthed the great King Shaka Sinzangakhona. So I grew up with all of that kind of oral sort of all those oral narratives. So in a very distant way, I saw myself, in a sense, as a daughter of Nandi because of my maternal roots. So yeah, so that's but of course, as I said, that I read a lot of book on Zulu history. I mean, I'm a student of history. I find history and where people come from. I find spirituality fascinating, how people worship, people's cultures, because that's where you find our humanity, when you understand somebody's history, when you understand somebody's culture, then it's I find that it's difficult to ill-treat someone whose story intimately because of their religion. If you've read up their books of worship and so on, and you find that there are so many more similarities than differences. So I'm very passionate about seeing people. Sometimes it's very difficult, because people don't want to be seen. They would rather kind of talk at each other. It's easier for all of us to just say, you know what, let me just retreat behind my own kind of world, but it's difficult to ill-treat somebody when you see them and you see their history, you see their culture and understand, what makes them strong, what makes them vulnerable, what challenges them. I find it intriguing. I find it intriguing, and yeah, reading is amazing. It's amazing because people are really very similar. Very similar. In fact, I was reading your book. I was telling you, I started reading Sophia, and it's so, just in terms of, that relationship of aggression, very similar, for example, to, Zukiswa Vanna's The Madams. Yes, it's a different world, but those power dynamics, again, the question of power, who's in charge, the terror in that household, the negotiating, the survival, I could just see so many similarities in situations that I know of. So yeah, I mean that's it's fascinating.
I think that you hit the nail on the head, and that books allow us to draw those bridges, and to
Yeah,
and to um, to empathize with different stories,
yeah,
different backgrounds in a way as well. They draw those
yeah,
bridges that we need for empathy, and I think that's what's important about these stories being written.
yeah.
Nokuthula, thank you so much for the time that you've given us this evening. I'm absolutely fascinated, and I always enjoy having this conversation immediately after the book is done because my head is brimming with even more questions, which I know
Yes,
we'll take offline as well.
yes.
And I certainly hope that Daughters of Nandi is widely read, and the conversations continue at various levels. It's a beautifully written book. It was a spiritual experience reading the book, and I'm quite sure it was the same in your process of writing from hearing you speak about it. And I wish you everything of the best in your writing journey ahead.
Shafinaaz, thank you so, so much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so that's it this weekend from Book Bites. We had an absolutely enlightening discussion. Until next week, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.